2,000 years ago, two great empires stood at opposite ends of the known world. In the west, there was Rome. In the east, there was Han China, and at its height, the Han Dynasty was every bit Rome's equal in power, population, and sophistication. Founded in 202 BC, the Han ruled for roughly 4 centuries and gave China so much of its lasting identity that, to this day, the largest ethnic group in China calls itself the Han people. This was an empire of perhaps 60 million people, stretching from the deserts of Central Asia to the coasts of the Pacific. It was bound together not just by armies but by an extraordinary machine of government, a professional bureaucracy of officials, many selected for their education and ability, administering provinces, collecting taxes, and enforcing law across thousands of kilometers. The Han pushed open the trade routes we now call the Silk Road, sending caravans of silk westward and bringing back horses, ideas, and silver. Their inventors gave the world paper, the wheelbarrow, and a bronze instrument that could detect distant earthquakes. Their historians wrote vast chronicles, their scholars debated philosophy and the proper way to govern. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most advanced civilizations the world had ever seen. And yet, like Rome, the Han Empire carried the seeds of its own destruction. Beneath the splendor of the imperial court, a slow rot was spreading, a poison of corruption, intrigue, and misrule that would, over a single dramatic century, bring this colossus crashing down. The fall of the Han is one of history's great cautionary tales, the story of how the strongest empire on earth can be hollowed out from within, until a single shock is enough to shatter it completely. The collapse of the Han began not on a battlefield but inside the imperial palace, in a poisonous tangle of court politics. In its later years, the dynasty was cursed with a run of emperors who came to the throne as children, some of them mere infants. A boy on the throne cannot truly rule, and so real power fell to those around him. 3 rival factions fought for control of the child emperors, and through them, the empire. There were the great consort clans, the families of the empresses and dowagers, who used their female relatives to gain influence over the throne. There were the Confucian scholar officials, the educated bureaucrats who saw themselves as the moral guardians of good government. And there were the eunuchs, castrated men who served in the inner palace, trusted because they could father no dynasty of their own, and who grew enormously powerful as the personal agents of weak young emperors. Again and again, these factions turned on one another. Emperors who wished to escape the control of their mothers' families often leaned on the eunuchs to purge their rivals, only for the eunuchs themselves to become a corrupt and grasping power, selling offices, enriching their allies, and crushing honest officials who dared to oppose them. Bloody purges swept the court. In one infamous episode, scholars and officials were banned from office, imprisoned, and executed for daring to criticize eunuch corruption. While the elite schemed and slaughtered one another for control of the palace, the actual business of governing the empire was neglected. Taxes were squeezed ever harder from the peasants to feed the luxury and bribery at the top. Justice was for sale. Out in the provinces, beyond the marble halls where eunuchs and ministers plotted, ordinary people were starving and their patience was running out. In the year 184, the suffering of the Han countryside finally exploded. The empire was reeling from a string of disasters, failed harvests, devastating floods of the Yellow River, and waves of epidemic disease that swept through a population already weakened by hunger and heavy taxes. Into this despair stepped a faith healer named Zhang Zhu, who preached a new religious movement promising a coming age of peace and the overthrow of the corrupt old order. His followers, drawn from the desperate rural poor, came to number in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. They wore yellow cloth around their heads as a symbol of the new age they believed was dawning, and history remembers them as the Yellow Turbans. In a coordinated uprising across multiple provinces, this messianic peasant army rose against the Han state. It was one of the largest rebellions in the ancient world, and it caught the dynasty badly off guard. The imperial government, its treasury drained and its court paralyzed by infighting, could not crush the revolt with central forces alone. So it made a fateful decision. It granted sweeping military and administrative powers to regional governors and local strongmen, authorizing them to raise their own armies to put down the rebels. The Yellow Turbans were eventually broken, drowned in blood over years of brutal fighting. But in defeating them, the Han had unleashed something far more dangerous to itself. Power had flowed out of the capital and into the hands of provincial commanders who now controlled loyal, battle-hardened armies of their own. The emperor in his palace was increasingly a figurehead. The men with the troops were the ones who truly mattered now, and some of them had begun to dream not of saving the dynasty, but of replacing it. With the throne now utterly weak and the provinces bristling with private armies, the final unraveling came quickly. In the year 189, the latest boy emperor's death triggered a fresh power struggle at court. In a desperate move against the eunuchs, a general was summoned to the capital with his troops. The result was catastrophe. The eunuchs were massacred, by some accounts more than 2,000 of them slaughtered in the palace, but into the chaos stepped a brutal frontier warlord named Dong Zhuo. He seized the capital, deposed one young emperor and installed another as his puppet, and ruled through terror, allowing his soldiers to loot and burn. When his rivals rose against him, Dong Zhuo torched the great capital city of Luoyang, one of the largest cities on earth, and dragged the court westward, leaving smoking ruins behind. The empire now dissolved into open warfare. The men who had raised armies to fight the Yellow Turbans turned them against one another, each carving out his own territory. Warlords with names that would become legendary in Chinese history, Cao Cao, Liu Bei, Sun Quan, fought across the ruins of the Han for supremacy. The emperor still existed, but he was a prize to be captured and used, a living seal of legitimacy passed between strongmen. The most cunning of the warlords, Cao Cao, took the last Han emperor under his protection and ruled in his name, commanding armies in the emperor's name while building his own power. For decades, China bled. Cities were depopulated, vast regions were ravaged by famine and war, and the census rolls suggest a staggering loss of life and order. The Han Dynasty still technically existed on paper. In reality, it was already dead, its corpse fought over by the ambitious men its own collapse had created. The end, when it finally came, was almost an afterthought. In the year 220, Cao Cao died, and his son Xiao Pai saw no further use in the charade of a Han emperor on the throne. He forced the last Han ruler, Emperor Xian, to abdicate and hand over the throne, declaring a new dynasty of his own. After more than 4 centuries, the Han Dynasty was formally extinguished, not overthrown in a great final battle, but quietly retired, its hollowed-out authority simply transferred to the warlord family that had long controlled it. But Xiao Pai's new dynasty did not reunite China. His rivals refused to accept it. Liu Bei, claiming to be a distant relative of the Han royal house, declared his own kingdom in the west, presenting himself as the dynasty's true heir. In the southeast, Sun Quan founded a third kingdom of his own. China was now split into 3 rival states, the famous 3 kingdoms, whose wars and heroes would be immortalized centuries later in one of the most beloved epics in all of Chinese literature. The unity that the Han had maintained for 400 years was shattered, and it would not be fully restored for centuries. China entered a long, turbulent age of division, war, and migration that would last, with only brief interruptions, until the rise of the Sui and Tang dynasties hundreds of years later. The fall of the Han is a story that echoes through history, a magnificent, advanced, and seemingly invincible empire, undone not by a single mighty enemy but by corruption at its heart, by the neglect of its own people, and by the desperate decision to hand power to ambitious men who would never give it back. The Han people endured, their name still defines a fifth of humanity. But the empire that gave them that name learned, too late, how quickly 4 centuries of glory can collapse into ruin.